In 1978, a crew of burglars made the fatal mistake of breaking into the home of Tony "Big Tuna" Accardo, the feared leader of the Chicago outfit. They thought they got away with millions, but they actually signed their own death warrants.
Mr. Accardo, I just want to come back to just a couple of things. Your nickname for years was Joe Batters, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Batters, Batters?
Yes, sir.
How did you come about that nickname?
I don't remember.
How long were you called that?
Oh, for years.
Since you were a young man?
Yes, sir.
Well, you know, Joe Batters doesn't sound anything like Tony Accardo. I mean, how did they come up with that name for you? Do you know?
No, sir.
Just one day somebody said to you, "You're now Joe Batters."
Yeah.
You don't remember who gave you that name?
No, sir.
Yeah.
Some of the best criminals in history have made their name with the audacious heists that they pulled and the big scores that they landed. The Great Train Robbery, the Antwerp Diamond Heist. These are robberies that live on in memory. Sometimes the men who carried out the crime can have their names forgotten. The job they pulled becomes bigger than the person themselves. What happens if you're part of a criminal enterprise, but you decide to rob the boss? How do you think it would go down if you chose to burglarize the home of the main man in your own group? Well, this is exactly what happened to the head of the Chicago outfit in the 1970s. Let's take a look at Tony Accardo, one of the most successful gangsters in history, and what happened when some of his own crew decided to rob his home. Antonio Leonardo Accardo was born on April 28, 1906 in Chicago, Illinois in the United States of America, 1 year prior to his birth in 1905. His mother and father, along with his older sibling, had made the move across the pond to America from Sicily and Italy. As with many recent immigrants, Antonio adopted a more Americanized version of his native Italian name, becoming known as Anthony Joseph Accardo, or just Tony. While he began to grow up in the tough streets of Illinois, it wasn't too long before Tony picked up some additional names. His propensity and clear talent for violence led to him being known as Joe Batters amongst his companions. But the nickname he would come to be nearly universally known by would be acquired later in his career: Big Tuna. From his early forays into the world of criminal enterprise, it quickly became clear that Tony was going to go far in his chosen profession. And he rose up the ranks of the infamous Chicago outfit, as if there was a rocket strapped to his back. The Joe Batters nickname he received was given by none other than Al Capone himself, after Accardo took out 3 men with a baseball bat. He started to make waves and became known not only for his ruthless efficiency when it came to both his personal enemies and people that could be dangerous to his organization at large, but for the respect that he garnered from his associates. The Big Tuna nickname was a product of a famous photograph that was taken of Tony, where he had successfully landed an enormous tuna on a fishing trip. It was printed in the local newspaper, and a lifelong nickname was cemented just like that. The Chicago outfit was growing exponentially at this time, making obscene amounts of money hand over fist. The streets were alive with opportunities for anyone with the know-how, the muscle, and a disregard for others to make their mark. Every space on the classic mob scene bingo board was being covered, and covered well by the Chicago outfit at the time. They were running protection rackets. They were money lending. They were heavily involved in the distribution of illicit and illegal substances of all kinds. They were making bank over to an extreme degree. It's estimated that they were pulling down somewhere in the region of $6 million a week, or somewhere north of $100 million a week in today's money. Truly breathtaking amounts of cash. Al Capone was the famous and infamous head of the outfit at this point in time, but he ended up getting arrested and sent down for tax evasion. Of all things, in 1932, this left Frank Nitti in charge, who was known as the Enforcer. Accardo was running his own team by this point, with the boss's permission. The men under his command were among the most feared and ruthless members of the outfit, and they all had the same qualities that would lead Tony Accardo ever upwards on his journey to the top. Capable of extreme violence, but also with smart heads on their shoulders and the ability to stay, for the most part anyway, out of the spotlight. While so many of the gangsters of the time seemed to thrive off the infamy, the headlines, and the reputation that came with what they did for a living, Tony had learned from a young age that there is more to be made in the long run by keeping your nose clean. This would prove itself true once again when Frank Nitti went away, at least briefly for tax evasion charges. While he was inside, Tony stepped up into the role of head of the outfit. In reality, he was co-head with Frank Nitti. But once the enforcer regained his freedom, conditions of his release kept him from having direct contact with his former criminal associates. Despite this, it was an open secret that while Tony was at the head of the table, Frank was always around, kept on payroll, and consulted on any major decisions. And under the relatively calm and steady hand of the two men, the organization just went from strength to strength. And with Nitti a free man, Accardo at the helm, and everything ticking along smoother than it had in a lot of years, it seemed as though things would only continue to get better. From there, not all was well in paradise, however. By the late 70s, a splinter group had formed underneath the boss's nose. A group that felt they were not getting the recognition or the respect they deserve. One that was determined to get notoriety, whatever way it could be gotten, and whatever it cost. The plan they came up with was one that must have been born out of desperation. Or it was one that maybe had become too familiar with Tony Accardo's calm and measured manner. One that had clearly forgotten this man was still Joe Batters from back in the day, that had murdered 3 men, who betrayed his boss with nothing more than a baseball bat. And a man who was now more powerful and respected than he had ever been before. So they decided to rob him. The crew in 10 on the burglary had worked under Tony for years prior. However, one of their most recent scores had brought some issues for the boss. They had hit up a jewelry store and made off with gold, diamonds, and money from it in late December 1977. So far so good, right? The crew can fence the swag and pocket the profits, as long as they kick the customary cutback up the chain to the higher-ups. Then everyone wins. Unfortunately for them, the place they had robbed was owned by a man who was not only a personal friend of Tony, he was also a man who was paying the mob protection money. And the problem presents itself pretty quickly. What sort of faith is anyone going to have in the Chicago outfit, protecting them if members of the very same group are just going to turn around and rob them? The solution was fairly straightforward. When it came in front of Big Tuna, no problem, nothing but a misunderstanding. The crew returns the cash and the loot. The business is made whole and is once again happy to pay their dues, knowing that the Chicago outfit will protect them as long as they pay their fees. Satisfied that this would sort out the entire affair, Tony went away to California on vacation, leaving the crew that had made the error with instructions to make it right. Instead, they decided to rob the Tuna. For as much as it can be seen as a bad idea from any viewpoint now, there can be no arguing that it was carried out as well and professional as any robbery could be, even if it was one. That was the equivalent of signing your own death warrant. It was sometime after midnight, in the very early morning of January 6, 1978, when they made their way onto the grounds of the River Forest Mansion. When the thieves forced their way into the River Forest Mansion, they bypassed high-tech security to reach the safe, but stealing from the man who succeeded Al Capone wasn't a robbery, it was an invitation to a bloodbath. It started as all burglaries would, with the services of what was known as a bypass man, a specialist that was adept at disabling, outwitting, or otherwise rendering alarm systems useless. This man was known as John Mendel and was the leader of the crew. Next to him, the second most senior member of the outfit was Bernard Buddy Ryan, along with his long-term associate, Stevie Garcia. Rounding out the team was defense Vince Moretti, a man who could move stolen goods and achieve the best price for them. He had been a long-standing associate of the outfit and made his choice to betray the boss, presumably for the money he stood to gain. That left the last 2 members of the crew, Bobby Hartogs and Johnny McDonald. Between them all, they managed to take cash, coins, and jewelry from the house before successfully leaving. The crew now just needed to offload the swag and hope and pray that no one would make the connection back to them. When Tony found out what happened, he was beside himself with rage and determined to get revenge on whoever had carried out the robbery. blocks north of the former Puritan warehouse, is Levin Sons Jewelry Store. It was there in December of 1977 that a gang of professional thieves circumvented the alarm system and had a field day inside the store. You must have a truck out there. They cleaned out the store, all the watches and everything else out of the showcases. Broke the showcases, the score was impressive. $1 million worth of jewelry. The swag authorities believe was stashed in Tony Accardo's then River Forest home. According to police, the Levinson burglars foolishly tried to retrieve the loot and broke into Accardo's house. It was a costly mistake. Soon, the bodies of 5 burglars began cropping up in car trunks. All had been tortured before they were murdered. The killers have never been apprehended. No one had any doubt that there would be blowback from this burglary. But it's possible that even in the blood-soaked and brutal halls of criminal organizations, the quick and brutal nature of revenge would be something to witness. One by one, everyone connected to the break-in began to disappear. Federal investigators knew who was behind the hits, but the Chicago outfit left behind no witnesses, no paper trail, and zero mercy. There was a very specific reason that the members of the crew were listed in that just order. Before at first glance, it probably looks like they were just an order of seniority or most involvement, but while that could probably be true, this was also the order in which severe and murderous recompense was meted out. Mendel, the mastermind and the expert at bypassing alarm systems, disappeared on January 15th, 11 days after the burglary. He would eventually reappear weeks later, except he was in the trunk of his own car. And also he was dead, both strangled and stabbed. The order in which it happened, probably making very little difference to him. Less than a week after Mendel vanished, Buddy Ryan, his number 2, got shot in the back of the head 4 times at the wheel of his car. The next to go was Stevie Garcia, being found in early February outside a hotel, having been murdered and stuffed into the trunk of a car. 2 days after, Garcia ruined the evening of passers-by and patrons of a local hotel. The fence and seller Vince Moretti would be the next to meet his maker. Rumors at the time were that Moretti was bold enough to be seen wearing some of the stolen jewelry in the aftermath of the robbery. Any chance of hearing if that was true from the man himself was stomped out of him on February 4th, as he was killed in a bar, alongside a friend that had no connection to the burglary, that had left only 2 men that had directly participated in the crime. And when the killings died off for nearly 2 months, the thought might have gone through the heads of Bobby Hertogs and Johnny McDonald that they had gotten away with it. Sadly for them, Johnny was taken out with a headshot on April 14th. Just over a week after her dog had been murdered by having his throat slit. At this point, every person that was directly involved in the burglary was dead, and the message had been sent out loud and clear. You do not steal from the boss. Big Tuna has stamped his authority in one of the most vicious retributions in recent memory. We need to remember we are dealing with a man that spent the grand total of 1 night in jail over the course of an alleged 80-year career. The fact that his houseboy disappeared a few months later, not long after testifying, is surely a coincidence. Similarly, the sad and unexpected deaths of Anthony Borsellino and Gerard Carlocello, 2 men suspected of cleaning up the burglary crew via bullets to the back of the head with nothing more than tragic happenstance. Much in the same way as Al Capone's Scarface, the most well-known gangster on the face of the planet, came undone at the hands of the IRS. This was the best tactic they had to go after Big Tuna. They tried to pull him in for tax evasion, and even got a fine of $15,000 and a sentence of 6 years. The equivalent of over $150,000 when adjusted for inflation. We aren't sure the length of prison term could be similarly adjusted, as it always seemed to happen with Tony. The conviction fell through the cracks a little. It was overturned and he remained a free man. In his later years, he was dragged to testify multiple times before various grand juries and inquisitions. Every single time Tony pled the fifth. He utilized his right to not speak more than 100 times and roundly denied having anything to do with controlling, running, or overseeing any criminal outfit. But the charges never stuck. Big Tuna died of natural causes, without a single standing conviction against his name. If the paper's fellow gangsters and law enforcement are to be believed, that Tony Accardo was involved in the Chicago outfit for decades, and sat at the head of the organization for a sizable portion of the time. He was responsible for overseeing the intake of hundreds of millions of dollars and spilling untold amounts of blood on the streets of Illinois and beyond. But if we go by the man's own testimony and the recorded criminal facts against him, he never had anything to do with any of it. Nothing stuck to him in a legal sense. Tony died without ever serving a prison sentence, whatever we choose to believe. The men that made the incredibly poor decision to rob Big Tuna's mansion that day all made extremely grisly ends. And as far as the courts have been able to prove, none of it was his doing. Make of that what you will. Tony Accardo died having never spent a single day in prison for these crimes. If you love deep dive Mafia documentaries, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tomorrow, we unlock another dangerous cold case. Stay safe.